sanctions, real mechanisms of destruction, like a bomb or a U.S. Marine disembarking on any coast. It is one of several multidimensional war strategies, and in this regard, the United States uses its financial hegemony. It controls their currency and financial institutions. The executors, a combination of corporate and political sectors. The bottom line is it fundamentally affects day-to-day life. This is a special on the American blockade, Venezuela and Cuba case. This is Chapter 4. This is what we're going to be analyzing today. We will have more information. We will have guests. And as always, we have your company. Thank you very much. Let's see, several points. In Vienna, Austria, the International Seminar on Unilateral Coercive Measures and Their Impacts is being held. A space organized by the Permanent Mission of Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba in Austria. Participants, including the Venezuelan Chancellor, Jorge Arias, highlighted that despite the illegitimacy and illegality, the United States and other powerful countries apply restrictions to achieve political and economical objectives. Cases like Cuba and Venezuela, even when at least regarding Cuba in the United Nations, the international community in full have supported the suspension of the blockade, except the United States and its ally Israel. From another UN instance, the illegality of the American policy is admitted. It was recently said the High Commissioner of Human Rights in the UN. I'm worried that the sanctions of this year on the blockade will already make the situation even worse. Let's see. Let's review. Let's see the location of the two countries we're speaking about, because they've been systematic victims of this. We see it on our digital screen. We see our continent. Let's go to the southern hemisphere. And there we have the northern coast of the Bolivarian nation of Venezuela. It has a geostrategic position that is very privileged. And additionally, it has a lot of natural resources. And going higher in the Caribbean Sea, we see the bigger sister, which is Cuba. These two countries are victims of systematic policies of sanctions on behalf of the United States. Let's continue seeing. Let's go to Mexico. We see an article that's called Mexico rejects the presence of the opposition of Venezuela and the OAS. This is part of the news we're analyzing today. This Thursday, this is yesterday, in the first session of the OAS that was held in Medellin, the opposition decided to credit a delegation led by Julio Borges. Mexico, their delegation, requested that in the documents be included what I read as follows. It said, since due to the irregularity in the report of the accreditation, which do not have legal foundation, Mexico reserves its right to question every decision that might come out of this session or of any decision coming out of the body itself. And on the bottom it said, against the assistance of the Venezuelan opposition delegation, the following countries have raised their voice: Nicaragua, Granada, Antigua y Barbuda, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, Bolivia, and Uruguay, who just left the session. And this is, well, let's recall that the legitimate government of Venezuela withdrew from the organization, and now we have an illegitimate representative there. Let's go to Knockout. This is a Brazilian blog of June 25th this year. It says, receiving Venezuelan military is exemplary. Is it exemplary or propaganda? A group of academics visit the refugee centers installed in Roraima to receive migrants from Venezuela at the beginning of June. Is that the objective genuinely humanitarian, or is it an operation coordinated by the Brazilian armed forces, just a propaganda and part of a major plan which tries to destabilize the Venezuelan government? Everybody comes in through Roraima: Venezuelan, Haitians, Guyanese, and others. However, for those who are not Venezuelan, the approach is completely different. They are left to their luck, leaving them without documents, medical attention, refuge, or food, thus pushing them to integrate the street population of greater Brazilian metropolis. The Venezuelans are very well attended to. Why? And this is what causes suspicion, this preferential treatment to the Venezuelan. And maybe they're just helping to see that to say that they have humanitarian help. But let's go back home, because on June 21st, this issue says sanctions, Trumpism, and neo-fascism. The author is Ángel Guerra, international analyst, and he says, the sanction policy carried out by the United States against Venezuela, Cuba, and other countries, very particularly during the government of Donald Trump, has a fascist nature. Just like Hitler, Trump transgresses international law, including breaching fundamental treaties for the survival of human genre. The penalties currently applied against Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran are geared towards the extermination of human groups, the same objective of the Nazism in the 30s and 40s against communist Jews and Gypsies. Here we have a first opinion of our critical moves. This week, after an intelligence operation, the Venezuelan has proved a new coup, a new attempt of coup. Who was behind? What was the interest? Let's go to Caracas. Adriana. Hi, Lucia. Yes, in fact, there is a plan. This would be the second attempt to carry out a coup. But it's just not a coup. This was going to be, this also involved assassinating generals, more than 10, 15, taking over military bases. There was always going to be theft of weapons, assaulting banks, and stealing the gold of Venezuela's reserve. But this is all done. This is done through the Venezuelan intelligence that took them 14 months, according to the government, following some opposition, and they were even filmed. and audio recordings, and they spoke about plans on how to carry out this plan of a coup. This was just 14 months, and they have more than 58 videos of proof. And the government has been publishing all of these videos. Independently of all of this, that is a grave declaration. This is on one hand. But how do the opposition attack the government? To kick out one government that has been legitimately elected, to install a government that nobody has voted for. So we see some opposers that follow Juan Guaidó, the self-imposed president, and nobody voted for him. But all of the people that have been detained point towards Guaidó. There are 14 people that are detained, and the investigation is ongoing. However, Nicolás Maduro, for the Day of the Journalist, he said that regardless all of what he is seeing, all of the internal aggressions and external aggressions, he says he's going to continue in the dialogue with the opposition. We're speaking about the Norwegian dialogue, because this began last week, and he says it's reserved, but he will advance on it, and the objective is to seek peace.
Gracias, Adriana.
Thank you, Adriana. Thank you for all the details. So what's going on with Cuba? It has a longer revolution. So for years it has had to undergo this policy, for more years, if we compare it with Venezuela. Let's go to Havana. Let's see the variation. But basically the Cuban sanctions have been ongoing. We're going to talk to Alien Fernandez from Havana. Hello, nice to greet you. If we're talking about the historical pressures of the United States government against Latin America, of course, that is the case of Cuba. And here we must refer to an action that for many international law experts call out as genocide, as an act of war. This is the North American blockade towards Cuba for the last 60 years. This blockade that has been argumented by the government of the United States with the most absurd justifications. Why the blockade? Well, at some moment they justified it as a support to the Cuban progressive movements in the region. For example, to the Sandinist revolution of Nicaragua, support to the revolutionary armed forces of Colombia, who wanted to achieve social justice in that Southern American country through the armed solution. And now these sanctions have increased. For example, we're talking about the application of Title III of the Helms-Burton Law. This has all been done under Donald Trump's presidency. A title that used to be in a drawer and is now applied for the first time. In addition, new restrictions on the travel of the U.S. citizens to Cuba. And now, what is the argument? The argument is that Cuba has military forces in Venezuela. That is to say that the history repeats itself again and again. Cuba has clearly said that what they have in Venezuela are collaborators on the social development of that Southern American nation. However, many experts consider that the blockade has not fulfilled its purpose. Instead of surrendering Cubans through hunger and to press the government to dismantle their political system, what it has done is to strengthen the independentist and anti-imperial ideas of Cubans, although unfortunately it has caused many damages and it must be lifted. We must recall that every year in the United Nations, the international community practically unanimously rejects the North American blockade. In a way, it is also a rejection to the domination pressures of the United States in the region. Thank you very much, Alien. We ask, why are they not able to render people by hunger and despair? How is it that Cuba and Venezuela are able to withstand this policy? We'll see what our guests say. And if you agree that the humanitarian crisis has just been a fake news to enrich a few. I'm going to show you our next guest, who's already waiting for us. We'll be right back after this short pause. Let's continue developing our critical move of today. It's a special of the U.S. blockade, Venezuela and Cuba, Chapter 4. In the case of Venezuela, the operation to defeat the Venezuelan government has been used in all strategies. It's a comprehensive attack that goes through every side: diplomatic, financial, military, communicational, that apparently is a very good tool to demonize the president and his actions. The global attack against Venezuela implicates an attempt against the president's life in August 2018, and later on July 30. Juan Guaidó, along with Leopoldo López, who has house restrainment, led a new phase of the coup. They had told everybody that the military had supported them, but the truth was that it was just a couple of low-ranking officials that were paid and received false promises to follow these two traitors. Later on, there is an ongoing mediation in Oslo, Norway. The first one to call out these meetings was Juan Guaidó, because he doesn't want any type of dialogue. China and the European Union has celebrated this mediation, and of course Venezuela is also participating. The attack has been defended by the U.S. A day after the conversations in Norway, Nicolás Maduro received the international group of contact that was conformed by the people of CARICOM, Bolivia, Mexico, Uruguay, and Ecuador. There, the effects of these sanctions the effects that they had, the 3-year sanctions imposed by the Trump administration. 2 weeks ago, the High Commissioner of Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, accepted the invitation posed by the president to visit the country and see for herself the situation. The former president met with all sectors, and she said that she bet on dialogue, and she will have a report for the upcoming July. She said that accepting this meeting is recognizing his authority. I would like to add our guest. He's Juan Romero, Secretary of Border Affairs, historian, and political scientist.
Doctor en procesos políticos contemporáneos en América Latina, geopolítico y además miembro de Resdal. ¿Cómo está, Juan?
¿Cómo estás tú?
Hello.
Gracias por estar acá para ayudarnos a descifrar esta jugada.
Let's see if you can help us decipher this critical move. Additionally to what we said, in prior days that we can prove that it's just a big attack.
De los hechos de actualidad, una nueva fase del golpe continuado. No son especulaciones, hay
These are new.
evidencia
Is
que
this a
las
new
personas
phase of the
concretas.
attack, or it's just
¿Qué
speculation?
nos está diciendo eso?
Pero yo creo que hay
Well,
una
I think
lectura contundente en términos
that
conceptuales.
it's a clear lecture of
La
this.
oposición
The
en este
opposition
marco de una guerra multidimensional
in this framework of
y las guerras
multi-dimensional
multidimensionales
war,
hay que entenderla, que pueden ir de reacciones muy violentas,
they
como
can
lo
have
que
like
vimos en este plan,
violent
o
reactions
diplomáticas,
or
operaciones
diplomatic
encubiertas,
or covert
presiones
operations,
a través de
pressure
ciberataques,
through cyber
en
attacks.
general un amplio abanico
In
de
general,
acciones,
it's
por eso
a
también se le denominan
wide
guerras multidimensionales,
spectrum
o guerras
Estrategias muy
híbridas.
sofisticadas, ¿no?
of actions.
Pero en general eso, en
However,
ese
in
marco,
general,
hay que ubicar que esta acción,
we have to
en mi
see
criterio, se
that this
ubica
action is
dentro de lo que es la idea conceptual de la agenda transgresora, que es una agenda
it's
transgresora.
a transgressive agenda,
Es un conjunto de
and this
acciones
is
que pueden seguir canales
a group of
legales,
actions that can follow
pueden,
legal streams, legal ways,
implementarse en los canales dentro del sistema político o pueden, como
or,
en este caso,
like in this
optar
case,
por operaciones encubiertas
go
o
through
operaciones de
covert
supervisión. Entonces, lo que vimos
operations.
es una agenda transgresora, no hay
So
ninguna
what they
duda.
have is a
Eso tiene que
complete
ver
agenda.
con tres elementos
This
esenciales.
has to do with
Lo
three
primero es
elements.
comprender
One, we have to
que
understand that
Venezuela,
Venezuela, in the international context, is a dissident voice, but it's just not any voice. It's not like they don't agree.
No estoy de acuerdo con su política de sumisión y de
It's not that they don't agree to the submission,
como lo dijo en un momento determinado Obama,
bend the knee.
sino que además,
But
en términos del
additionally,
sistema político,
in terms
es
of
la
political
democracia
system,
venezolana, junto con la democracia ecuatoriana y la
the
democracia en Bolivia,
Ecuadorian,
las únicas que
Venezuelan,
se definen como
these are
democracias
democracy
representativas. Esto no es
that are
cuestión de
not
detalle, porque
representative
además el modelo que
democracies.
se implementa de democracia representativa
Because
es
what
también lo
our
podemos
system
catalogar como democracia capitalista, es decir, una democracia que realiza elecciones
it
periódicamente,
is a democracy
que no
that
busca procesos
holds
de
elections,
constante, que no genera mecanismos de participación, y aquí hay que entender que la participación puede ser
and
puede ser la participación
normally
electoral,
other countries
cualquiera puede
do
decir,
that.
pero es que hay participación en toda América Latina. Sí, ese es un tipo de participación.
Those are just
Pero la
participations
otra
for
participación
voting.
es en el diseño de las políticas.
But the other type is like Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador. There's a difference. It's just not a representative democracy. It's a participatory democracy because people are involved in designing the policies of the country. And behind Venezuela, there's a position in all of the system, universal system. It's not just any position. It's not just like if Venezuela says something. It's not that they just denounce, but Venezuela, along with just calling out on the American strategy,
1818, recordemos el año pasado se cumplieron 200 años de las comunicaciones de Bolívar con el agente diplomático norteamericano en Venezuela, Irving. Y en esa agenda es donde surge la promesa de Bolívar. Los Estados Unidos parecen destinados por la providencia a plagar de hambre y miseria.
Even Bolívar already said it. The U.S. will sow hunger in our country. So Venezuela has an anti-North American agenda. And what we add, what the Venezuelan policy adds, is it's a world context.
El marco referencial de la política exterior norteamericana en este momento busca imponer áreas de libre comercio.
And what the U.S. tries to impose is free trade, reduction of welfare countries, submission of the military actions to the police force, open up all of the barriers to the North American capitals. As confronting this, there's a strong voice that is Venezuela's voice, and that is what has led President Trump, well, before Obama, now President Trump, to call us out as a threat. We're not a threat in the military terms. If we compare the U.S. forces There are like more than 3 million distributed in 1,000 military bases. It's the symbolic importance that Venezuela has. This is how we connect to Cuba, because Cuba also has the same line, not only in their discourse, but in the day-to-day practice. This is what we see with Che Guevara in Punta del Este. And now it's complemented with Venezuela. We can say that Venezuela is much more than Cuba, that maintain the ideology of confrontation with the U.S. policy. So we see several things. On one hand, multidimensional war that tried to take over the Venezuelan government. And there are several important elements. The difference between the dollar of Nicolás Maduro and the blue dollar is here in this moment, so people can understand. Because what this author says is that they're trying to have an influence on the minds of the people in Venezuela. The dollar doesn't have the number of the currency exchange that at the moment it has. It's just been manipulated because Venezuela has enough gold reserves to make their money strong. But of course, that is part of the aggression, to have a very high exchange currency. Following a historical tradition, by 2010, he makes a change on the foreign policy, and this is what allows what Jorge Arriaza says. What he says is that Arriaza says that the United States is not behind the coup, it's just in front of it. They even issued a document that guides the invasion. And it says, if the United States is not able, through a diplomatic medium, to bend the position in their favor, they will have to create a subversive war. This is what they've done. Those elements that Jorge Rodriguez showed is nothing else than the transgression agenda. The first thing is that the threat of an invasion has been diminished because the intelligence of the U.S., based on the information given by the Venezuelans, was totally fake. The situation is not so bad, the militaries are not so upset. It's not like we're going to kill each other here. And two, it's not true that the Chavism is weak, and that the policy that's being taken over by Maduro, and it's not true that they're declining in their force. Those two things is what makes the U.S. despair, and they're trying to find other measures. And in third place, although the director of the Bolivarian intelligence left, the evidence shows that there was not a disbalance of the intelligence system of Venezuela, and that it has worked with early alert and contention. Well, being optimistic in my criteria, makes the pressures to increase, because it's no longer just a threat of invasion, because the conditions are not given. Well, the situation of our neighbors like Colombia is not good. It has increased the areas of coca plantation, and it concentrates the most production of drugs. And the second one is all of the documents emitted by the United Nations against Colombia of selective assassination in Colombia. So that puts Colombia in a hard situation. And the other element, to try to explain through the American logic, is to use it through Guyana. However, it's a very dispersed country, and it has no military capacity that could allow that to happen. And the third neighbor would be through the air, but we do have strategic defense in that area, because we do have dissuasive weapons provided by China and Russia. We were speaking about what the government has just revealed. Let's play a small tape of what the vice president said. We're not only in the presence of two coups d'etats, one to impose the self-proclaimed as the leader of a de facto government, but another one, a coup d'etat, to try to liberate Baduel, who is paying a sentence for stealing and trying to make him the president of Venezuela. Several keys. The opposition has not said anything, right? Why? Well, several elements. Well, all of these actions fall into this document that was issued by the U.S. that is to do covert operation. And in this strategic document, it says that if you have a military force that can destabilize the country, it will work. And it will allow the U.S. with internal elements to say that there were some justifications. And there would have been people in Colombia, in Panama. Well, there's a phrase of a poet. Silence also speaks for itself. Here, the silence is indicative the complicity and the conspiracy in this operation. Now, Juan, the opposition, there is a plan of corruption. Let's remember this, and then we'll go to a pause. Juan Guaidó and several leaders of his party, through some infiltrators, along with the U.S. government, stole from Citgo $8 billion, according to what the vice president of Venezuela said. Guaidó named Carlos Vecchio as member of Citgo and ambassador to the U.S. Through that, they took over illegally of Venezuelan funds Pan Am Post also says they stole millions of dollars that were donated to humanitarian aid. What is truth is that Guaidó and company has taken a lot of money that was given to him for supporting the cause.
Tus consideraciones.
No, varias
Let's go to
cosas
your
que comentaba
considerations.
mientras te escuchaba. Tú me hacías una pregunta, ¿cómo
You
sucede
asked
esto? Bueno,
how could this
esto
happen
tiene
in
que ver con
Citgo?
la progresividad y las acciones de esta agenda transgresora.
Well, this has to do with how progressive this agenda is.
Remembranza histórica de lo que sucedió.
Let's have a historical
Se
look.
autoproclama.
Guaidó
Autoproclamación
takes over.
intenta
He's
la aplicación en
self-proclaimed.
Venezuela del mismo esquema en Libia, o sea, un gobierno
And he
paralelo.
does it
¿Cuáles
just
han
like
sido
Libya,
las
with a
aristas
parallel
en este caso?
government.
Bueno,
What have
no
been the
contaban, al
characteristics?
contrario del ejemplo en Libia, con apoyo militar,
Well,
y eso ha dificultado que en términos
Guaidó
objetivos,
has
Guaidó
no
pueda decir,
military
"Yo soy el
support,
presidente
so
en
he cannot say, I am the
Sin
president.
embargo,
However,
a pesar de ese éxito, que es un éxito que
although
hay que
that there was
negárselo a la unidad cívico-militar
a
y al
relative
liderazgo del
success
presidente Nicolás Maduro y la fortaleza del Partido
that has not
Socialista
been
Unido de Venezuela
concreted
y de los
because
factores
Nicolás
militares
Maduro
que
is
lo
still a
apoyan,
president,
hay una acción paralela en el exterior. Esa acción
there
paralela
is
tiene que ver
a
con el
parallel action
nombramiento o el
outside the
intento de
government
nombramiento
and
y
abroad,
reconocimiento por parte de países que forman parte de las
and that
organizaciones
has received
internacionales
some
de ese
recognition.
gobierno ilegítimo. Y Guaidó nombra
And Guaidó names representatives
representantes que han llegado al extremo, por ejemplo, de intentar incorporarse
that
a las
have
Naciones Unidas,
even
o
tried
como
to
acaba de suceder
incorporate
recientemente
in
Medellín,
United
la Organización
Nations
del
or in the OAS,
Eso que
which just
buscaba,
happened in Medellín.
buscaba
What
que
was
a
that?
través de esos
What was he
representantes,
seeking? That
en
through
casos
those
como, por ejemplo, tiene
representatives,
que ver con Estados
in
Unidos, con
cases
Colombia,
like
de
the
nuevo,
U.S.
Estados Unidos en Cisgo,
or
y
Colombia,
en Colombia con la empresa Monómeros, se nombre una nueva junta
that
directiva
new
desde la condición espurua, desde la
new people
condición
be
ilegítima
named
que
on the board of
asume Guaidó.
representatives
Eso que
of these
facilita
companies that are
facilita al
abroad.
gobierno de Estados Unidos, que está en una actitud de violación del Estatuto de Roma, porque
And
lo
of
que hace
course,
Estados
they're
Unidos
violating the
no
Statute
solo
of
es un
Rome
crimen de lesa humanidad,
because
sino
what
que
they're
se llaman
doing
crímenes de agresión.
is
Son
a crime
crímenes
of
donde un
aggression.
Estado agrede a otro
These
Estado
are
buscando
crimes
desequilibrar
where one
y
country
violentando tres normas del derecho
attacks
público
another one,
internacional. No
violating
injerencia,
three
respeto a los
principles:
asuntos internos
non-interference,
y respeto a la
respect
soberanía.
to sovereignty, and respect to
Colombia hace
external
de
affairs.
permite el gobierno colombiano
So the
levanta
Colombian
las
government
sanciones que había, las
lift
medidas coercitivas, porque tampoco son
the
sanciones, porque el derecho internacional
coercive
público, las sanciones tienen que ver
sanctions
con un pronunciamiento contundente en contra de un país, el país se niega a corregir y entonces que se producen las
Hay que
sanciones.
sancionarlo, claro.
Aquí no hay, estas son medidas coercitivas.
So these are unilateral
Colombia
measures.
accede a la petición de Guaidó de una nueva
Colombia
junta directiva, entonces, nueva
accepts
junta
a
directiva de
new
Monómeros,
board of
nueva junta
members
directiva de Cisgo, comienzan a
in Citgo
generar
and in
la
companies that are
movilización de las
placed in
cuentas.
Colombia.
¿Eso qué ha sucedido? Cisgo
So this is what
recibe
happened.
un proceso de negociación de más de 1.800 millones de dólares para
And since
procesar
Citgo
el tema de la deuda. 1.800 millones de dólares
received
que
money,
van a seguir el mismo destino
and
que
now
el
they are,
concierto en Cúcuta.
and of course those are in hands of Guaidó, and the monies will probably happen with the same end that would happen with the concert in Colombia, and it goes directly to his pocket. So we can show is that behind this agenda there is financial interest,
con actores transnacionales que están detrás de los enormes recursos
and
que por
these
concepto
international
de
companies are
explotación,
behind
del petróleo
the
tienen
money
Venezuela,
of
no solo
Citgo
en su
and the
territorio
other company in
ya no
Colombia.
solo el petróleo que está aquí, sino los activos que nosotros tenemos en Estados Unidos y que tenemos.
And it's not only a matter of the companies we have here in Venezuela, but the ones we have abroad.
La ayuda humanitaria bien entre comillas.
Y eso también tiene una explicación.
And that also has an explanation,
Una lógica del capitalismo es la necesidad de
that
acumular,
capitalism
la incesante
always
de acumular.
has a principle
Eso no
of
es una excepción para el caso de los
accumulating.
actores venezolanos y mucho menos para los actores que
This
encabeza
is-
el propio presidente Donald
This is not our case. This is not the case of Venezuela.
La política regional nos espera en el horizonte político cercano una tríada de elecciones bien interesante que podría
Well,
abonar
there's an
a
upcoming election
cambiar un
period
poco la correlación de fuerzas en
that
el
might
país.
change
Pausa
the
y luego
correlation
regresamos.
of powers. Let's go to a pause and we continue talking later.
vamos a revisar
Let's
seguidamente
review
especial de jugada crítica
in
sobre el
this
bloqueo
special
casos Venezuela y Cuba.
case of Venezuela, Cuba.
Venezuela y sus efectos. Desde enero de 2019,
Since January
han
2019,
esos ataques.
they
Y
have
no
been even
debemos
worse
entenderlos como restricciones a un
because we
puñado de
cannot see just
personalidades en el
restrictions
gobierno o con
about a
algún poder,
government
¿no? Porque eso es lo que difunde la
because
mediática
that's what they want
tradicional y
us to
confunde.
think.
Tenemos que comprenderlo como
We
una
have to
batería de
understand like a
acciones
battery
que imposibilitan al Estado hacer y
of
por ende
sanctions that
lesionan
don't
al
let the
pueblo que
government do
necesita
things.
salud, educación, alimentos y pare de contar. 26 de enero. Banco de
January
Inglaterra anunció la
26,
confiscación ilegal
Bank
de
of
1.359 millones de dólares en oro venezolano.
there have been millions of
28 de
dollars
enero,
of gold.
Departamento del Tesoro emitió nuevas sanciones contra la
News
estatal
March
Petróleos de Venezuela y
19,
su filial Citgo.
Citgo
Congeló
has
7.000
been
millones de dólares
taken
en
over.
activos y 11.000 millones más en
11 billion in
exportaciones.
exports.
En territorio
In the American
estadounidense
territory, it
quedó
was
prohibido
prohibited
transar
to
con
negotiate
PDVSA, así como
with
vender
PDVSA as
diluyentes
well as sell
necesarios
diluents
para refinar
necessary to
crudo
refine
venezolano.
raw oil
Solo unas pocas empresas
from
como
U.S.
Chevron
to
quedaron
Venezuela.
excluidas de la
Only
medida hasta
Chevron
el 29 de abril.
were excluded
19 de marzo,
until
fueron
April
bloqueadas
29.
operaciones de la
March
empresa de
19,
producción y venta
block
de oro
operations
Minerven.
of
El
Minerven
Departamento del
Gold
Tesoro
Production and
justificó la
Sales Company.
acción
The
alegando
Treasury Department
perseguir
justified the
supuestas
action alleging
operaciones
to
ilícitas en
prosecute
oro
the
del Estado
illicit
venezolano.
operation in gold of the
Entre los
Venezuelan
días
state.
5 y 12 de abril,
Between the 5
fueron
and 12 of
bloqueadas
April,
operaciones de más
operations
de
of more
30
than
buques
30
petroleros de la
PDVSA oil
estatal
carriers were
PDVSA.
blocked.
17 de abril, el
April
Departamento
17,
del Tesoro
the Department of
nuevamente
Treasury
aplica
blocks
su política de
transaction of
bloqueo,
Central Bank
esta vez
of
contra
Venezuela,
operaciones
especially
del
in
Banco
accounts
Central de
abroad
Venezuela,
and the
específicamente
development
cuentas en
of the
dólares en el
institution
extranjero
in the
y el
international
desenvolvimiento
financial
de esa
system
institución
in
en el
order to
sistema
avoid
financiero
funding to
internacional,
purchase
lo cual incluyó
medicine
compra
and
de
food
medicamentos y
necessary for
alimentos
social
y productos
protection
básicos.
in the population.
24 de
April
abril,
24th,
Departamento de Estado
the Department of
publica
State
un
of the United
informe
States published an
titulado
entitled
Fact
report
Sheet US
saying
Action
fact
on
sheet
Venezuela,
U.S. actions
en el que
on
asume
Venezuela,
haber
in which
aplicado no
it
menos de
assumes
150
to have
medidas
applied no
coercitivas
less than
contra la
150
nación
coercitive
suramericana
measures
desde
against
2017.
Venezuela since
El documento fue
2017.
eliminado
The
en
document
24
was
horas.
eliminated in 24
Aparentemente
hours.
fue un error. En total,
In total,
tiene
Venezuela
más de
has more than
$5.7
$5.7 billion
congelados
frozen
en
in
unos
50
50
international
bancos
banks
internacionales
of
en
countries
países
like
como
the
Estados
United
Unidos,
States,
Portugal, Inglaterra y
Portugal,
otros.
England, and
Estas
others.
medidas
Coercitive
no solo
measures not
torpedean
only
el ritmo
damage the
normal de la
economy of
economía del
countries,
país, sino
but
que
the
afectan el
welfare of
bienestar del pueblo
Venezuelan people.
venezolano. Y
The
el hecho
facts
queda
are,
reflejado en cifras. 40.000
40,000
personas
people
fallecieron
died
entre
between
2017 y
2017 and
2018.
2018.
80.000 pacientes con
80,000
VIH no
patients of
reciben
HIV have
tratamiento
not received
antirretroviral
treatment
desde
since
2017.
2017.
16.000
16,000 people
personas
await for
esperan por
dialysis.
diálisis.
16,000
pacientes
oncological
no
patients do
reciben
not receive
tratamiento.
treatment.
4
4
millones
million
de diabéticos e
diabetic and
hipertensos no
hypertense do
tienen
not have
acceso a
access to
insulina con
insulin or
medicinas
cardiovascular
cardiovasculares.
medicine.
Eso último es mucho más que cifras. Es lo
This
que
last
decíamos
part
al
is
comienzo.
much more than numbers.
Son agresiones que
These are
lesionan
aggressions that
los
hurt
derechos fundamentales del pueblo
fundamental
venezolano. ¿Qué
rights
pasa en
of
el caso de
Venezuelan
Cuba?
people.
Hoy hay
What happens in the
reconocimiento del
case
bloqueo. El
of
que no crea que es así,
Cuba?
no entiende nada de lo que está pasando y es constante. Hay
This is
efectivamente
a
una persecución
constant
financiera.
damage
Eso
on
lo
Cuba.
decía, palabras más, palabras menos, recientemente el presidente de la República de Cuba, Miguel
This is
Díaz.
what the president of Cuba had just said. The sanctions imposed on Cuba since 1960, with the beginning of the blockade, and that was worse with the Helms-Burton law in 1996 with Bill Clinton, are part of economic terrorism that has applied the U.S. government to depose administrations that do not agree with the U.S. and continue to take over their natural resources and productive resources. The latest attacks applied by the Trump government have been thought to damage sensible sectors like education and health. The last one has even affected tourism because now there is restrictions on tourism for the U.S. citizens, which is $5 billion less for Cuba.
Bueno, allí lo vemos, Juan.
Well, there you have it.
De nuevo,
Well, once again,
insisto muchísimo
I insist
en la importancia de
of the
dos cosas.
importance
Primero,
of two
el
things.
correcto manejo
One,
conceptual de lo que está ocurriendo.
the correct management of
Porque
what's
una de las
happening.
operaciones esenciales
One
de
of the
la guerra
things
multidimensional
that
es
is
la creación de
fundamental
confusiones conceptuales.
is
Realmente
confusing
bueno, ¿qué tan
conceptual
importante puede
terms.
ser
En eso los medios hacen el
Sí,
trabajo
en eso,
primordial,
ese
¿no?
es el trabajo.
Like, how
La
important
generación,
are
Chomsky lo definía
these
muy bien.
principles?
Eso es una operación de generalización.
It's a
En el
generalization
budismo,
strategy
se dice algo muy parecido. En el budismo se dice, bueno, muchas
because
veces la gente no se da cuenta
things
de que
are
está
things
viva
are said like
como
relatively
dormida. Bueno,
close
los
one
medios
to
de
another.
comunicación,
However, when they're just distorted, misconstrued, it generates a process of putting people to sleep that is seeking to create a shield so people cannot perceive reality.
Lo que sentimos a través de nuestros distintos formas de aproximarnos a esa realidad. Eso es clave.
That is key.
Las cosas por su nombre.
We have to call things by their names. One, it's a multidimensional war, very complex. It generates unilateral measures, coercive measures. Two, it's part of a strategy that seeks to build conditions to facilitate turbulence, social turbulence. So this is a condition that affects the quality of life of the common citizen, like electricity, running water, services, food, medicine, security. And by generating this alteration, this can become a collective psychosis. And this is where the news media play a big role, because this affects the rational thinking. Then we have our affectionate side that generate feelings. And the last one, the last type of intelligence, when it's more basic and animal type of way of thinking. So psychosis tries to touch and affect and take us to our last way of thinking, and based on that create an agenda of violence. And what this happens is that if you have a relative that has some medical problems, diabetes or anything, and these people don't get the medicines, and you try to point fingers at somebody, you say it's the President Maduro, it's his fault. So this becomes psychosis. And that's where the news media work. They try to gear all our hate against our president. Of course, what is not said is everything that you just showed. 40,000 Venezuelan patients that are seeking medical attention. What is not said is that the blockade has generated losses up until now. So yeah, they say that the measures are recent. No. The studies show 132 billion in economic capacity of the country. We have our resources that are being retained in banks abroad. And that's where our mission is to humanize this reality. What just happened in Venezuela is our foundation Fundalatin to show the patients of HIV and cancer, that show how these patients can't receive medical attention, not because of the government, but because of the blockade, and avoid the implosion that is being generated by the media.
Special Forum Conventional Warface es mucho más económico impulsar una
because according to the U.S. document, it's cheaper to create internal division than just going on a military invasion. We have just a couple of minutes. I would like to ask you, there are upcoming elections that might have some influence, especially in the Argentinian case. Well, the Argentinian case is emblematic. Why? Because when Macri took over office, he arrived under the criteria that the governments of his predecessors, which are of both Kirchner's, and he says that they had failed, and that the medium class had become impoverished because of them. That middle class has been affected by the reduction of state, freezing of salaries, which is the traditional recipe that is applied by capitalism. So Macri is now confronted with a good part of the Peronism that is represented by Cristina Fernández. And everything indicates that Cristina will probably come back to office, and that totally transform the reality of Argentina. There's another case. And that with these new elections, we might have a recomposition of the forces. A friend of mine says that the century of the progressive movements has not frozen. It was just momentarily stopped by the recomposition of forces. I am very positive, and according to what Paulo Freire said, hope by itself is not enough. But without any hope, there is no possibility of construction. I do have hope in the possibilities that this awakening that came to Latin America, it be a constant, and that we are able to take over, and not in a negative way, but take over by the poor people. And we hope that this is what might happen, to reject this capitalism who has no human connection, and that has also proven not to be efficient. Thank you very much, Juan Romero. We're going to keep on analyzing this topic. Let's go to conclusions. Okay, the cases of Venezuela and Cuba. About Venezuela, a myriad of sophisticated methods, among which we see unilateral coercive measures, all the way to creating social turbulence and collective psychosis. As our last guest just said, the recent events speak of a transgressive agenda with covert operations that, among other things, seek to appropriate themselves of huge resources, those of the state and those that arrive through the famous so-called humanitarian aid. Participatory and protagonic democracy is part of the dissidence of countries like Cuba and Venezuela. And if we see the neighboring Colombia, it is in no condition to post a war on Venezuela, even although they are constantly conspiring against us. In the international scenario, nothing has been achieved because there are still heavyweights on Venezuela's side. So, this is what's going on. Thank you very much for keep staying with us. See you tomorrow.